Brit. 1 room, 1 bed, the cowboy said. And the storm gave the Apache woman no way out. The sun was low in the sky, its orange glow stretching across the dry plains of the Arizona Territory. Brit. The wind had picked up over the past few hours, carrying dust and small pebbles that stung the skin of anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in it. James, a lone cowboy, walked steadily along the narrow trail, his boots crunching over the rocky ground. Brit. He had been traveling for days, moving from one ranch to another, seeking work and food, but mostly searching for shelter before the winter storm that was slowly creeping over the horizon. James was not a young man anymore, but he was strong and careful. Desperate. His face was lined with the marks of years spent under the sun, riding across open land, repairing fences, and breaking in wild horses. He had learned early that the world could be harsh, and he had learned to survive in it. Brit. Today he wore a long brown coat, worn at the edges but still protective against the cold. His hat was pulled low to shield his eyes from the wind. Brit. Behind him, his horse, a sturdy brown mare named Daisy, followed quietly, sensing the storm that was building and keeping close to him. Far to the west, hidden among rocky cliffs and sparse brush, a young Apache woman named Nayeli moved silently. Her footsteps were careful and light, avoiding the dry twigs that could snap underfoot and give away her position. She had left her village a few days ago, guided by the stories of danger from the nearby settlers who were moving ever closer to her people's lands. Brit. She carried little, just a small satchel with some dried food, a water gourd, and a blanket. Her eyes were sharp, always scanning the horizon for danger, and her mind was alert, constantly planning the next step. Brit. Nayeli knew the land well, but even she could not fight the storm that was coming. The sky darkened faster than either of them expected. Brit. Clouds rolled in like a heavy gray curtain, and the first drops of rain fell, cold and heavy. James quickened his pace, knowing he needed to find shelter soon. Brother. He had heard of an old cabin not far from the trail, abandoned long ago but sturdy enough to withstand a storm. The thought of a warm fire and a dry place to sleep gave him hope, though he knew he would have to be careful. Brit. The cabin, after all, could be home to someone else, and strangers in these parts could be dangerous. Nayeli, meanwhile, felt the cold bite deeper as the wind picked up. Brit. She had hoped to reach a hidden canyon by nightfall, but the storm had caught her too early. She was exhausted, hungry, and worried. Brit. Her people had taught her how to survive in the wild, but even the best knowledge could not fight nature when it turned against you. She searched the rocky landscape for any sign of shelter. Brit. Her sharp eyes finally spotted the silhouette of the cabin in the distance, a dark shape against the fading light. Relief washed over her, but she also felt a spark of caution. Brit. She did not know who, if anyone, might already be there. As she approached, James reached the cabin at almost the same time. Brit. He paused at the door, his hand on the old wooden handle, listening to the wind howl around the building. The cabin had a simple design, a single room with a small fireplace and one bed that was probably left behind by the previous owner. Brit. Dust covered the floorboards, and cobwebs hung from the corners. Still, it was better than facing the storm outside. Brit. He pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly. The inside smelled of dry wood and cold earth. Brit. James stepped in cautiously, placing his satchel on the floor and untying Daisy outside to graze on the sparse grass nearby. He needed to start a fire quickly, and he was grateful that the cabin had an old pile of wood in the corner. Brit. Just as he was kneeling to gather the wood, he heard a soft sound outside. A careful step on the wet ground. James froze, his hand tightening around the small knife he always carried at his side. Brit. His eyes moved to the doorway, and there she was. Nayeli, standing hesitantly, her dark hair wet from the rain, her eyes wide but determined. For a moment, neither spoke. Britt. The wind roared outside, rain hammering against the roof, and the world seemed to shrink to the space of the cabin. James noticed the slight tremble in her hands, the way her eyes searched his face for threat or kindness. Britt. He knew immediately that she had nowhere else to go. The storm had trapped her, just as it had threatened him. Britt. "You can't stay out there," James said finally, his voice calm but firm. "It's too dangerous." Britt. "Come in." Nayeli studied him for a long moment. She had been taught to trust no stranger, especially a man alone in the wilderness. Britt. But the storm was relentless, and she could see the fear in his eyes matched her own. Slowly she nodded and stepped inside, careful to avoid touching anything that might betray her presence. Britt. The cabin was small, smaller than she expected, but at least it was dry. James gestured to the firewood. "I'll light the fire," he said. "You can sit near it." Britt. "It'll be warmer." Octon Niley nodded again, keeping a small distance from him. She placed her satchel down and opened it, revealing a few pieces of dried corn and some jerky. Desperate, James noticed, and he smiled faintly, understanding that they might have to share what little they had. Hunger and cold had a way of breaking pride, and he could see that she was just as human as he was. The first sparks caught the dry kindling, and soon a small flame danced in the hearth, casting shadows across the walls. The warmth spread slowly, but it brought a sense of comfort neither of them had felt for days. Britt. Outside, the storm battered the cabin relentlessly, but inside there was a fragile bubble of safety. Neither spoke much at first. Words felt unnecessary in the face of the storm. James tended to the fire, carefully stacking the wood, while Nayeli sat on the far side of the room, pulling her blanket tightly around her shoulders. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, noting the careful movements, the patience in his hands, and the way he glanced occasionally toward her as if making sure she was okay. After a while, James spoke again. "Britt. Name's James," he said simply. "I've been riding these lands for years." Britt. "Never liked the cold, never liked being alone." "Seems tonight I get both." Britt. Nayeli considered him, then said softly, "Nayeli." Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying the strength of someone who had survived much already. The fire crackled, and the wind howled, and for a moment the storm outside became just background noise. Britt. Two strangers thrown together by chance and necessity shared the warmth of a small cabin in the middle of a dangerous night. Neither knew what the morning would bring, but for now, they were safe. Breath. Hours passed. The rain turned to sleet, and the wind slammed against the walls. Britt. James added more wood to the fire, and Nayeli pulled her blanket closer. She could feel the tension in the room, a delicate balance between trust and caution. She was far from home, far from anyone who could protect her, and she knew the cowboy could be her only ally until the storm passed. Despite the danger, there was also a strange sense of connection forming. Both had faced hardship before, both had learned to survive alone. And now, trapped in a small space with no other choice, they were forced to confront something neither of them expected. The possibility that a stranger could be more than just another obstacle. The night grew darker, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. Outside, the world was harsh and cold. But inside, the small fire cast light on two figures who had nothing in common except the need to survive. And that night, as the wind howled and the rain fell in heavy sheets, James and Nayeli realized that sometimes survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about finding trust in the most unexpected places. For now, the cabin was all that mattered. One room. One fire.
One night, and though neither spoke of it aloud, both understood that the storm had changed something.
It had brought them together, and neither could deny the fragile thread of hope that flickered between them, as small and precious as the fire that kept them warm. The storm outside had grown stronger, the wind howling like a restless animal across the plains. Rain and sleet hammered the small cabin, drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof and windows. James and Naeli sat near the fire, both silent for a long time, listening to the storm and feeling the small warmth it brought. Despite the small size of the cabin, the distance between them felt wide, an invisible line of caution and pride neither wanted to cross. James stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. He had faced many storms before, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the sudden presence of someone else in this small space, someone he did not know or trust fully.
Yet there was also a strange sense of responsibility that settled on him. The storm was fierce, and the woman before him had nowhere else to go.
James had always lived by a simple rule. If someone needed help and you could give it safely, you did. It was not bravery, nor was it kindness. It was survival. Naeli, on the other side of the room, pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She could feel the chill from the storm creeping into her bones, despite the fire. She had spent many nights in the open air, under the stars, hiding from danger, running from those who might harm her. But tonight was different. Tonight. She could not hide. The storm left her no choice. She had to remain in this cabin, in the company of a man she did not know. Her heart beat fast, a mixture of fear and caution.
She did not fully trust James, but she could see the same fatigue in his face that she felt in her own body. The wind made the cabin groan.
One of the shutters rattled violently against the wall, threatening to break free. James moved quickly, holding it in place until it stopped shaking. Naeli watched him, noting his calm and steady movements. She realized that he was careful, deliberate, and strong. There was a quiet confidence in the way he handled the small emergencies the storm created. She had learned long ago to observe people, to judge their actions more than their words. Tonight, she could see that James was someone who valued caution and care. That thought brought a small, reluctant comfort. After a while, James spoke, breaking the silence. "The storm is worse than I expected," he said, his voice low and steady.
Might be a long night.
Naeli nodded but did not speak immediately. She wanted to test him, to understand whether he was friend or merely another obstacle.
"I have never seen a storm like this," she said softly. "The wind, it is strong." James gave a small smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "I've seen plenty of storms in my life," he admitted. "Some worse than this, some not so bad. But every time, it feels the same, small and helpless against it. Makes you respect it." The fire crackled, sending tiny sparks into the air, and for a moment, both of them allowed themselves to simply breathe, listening to the storm as if it were a living creature. Outside, the world was wild and dangerous. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the small space of the cabin created a fragile sense of safety. Yet the tension remained. They both understood the cabin could only hold so much peace. The storm could last hours, and the space was too small for long-term comfort. Naeli shifted slightly, pulling her blanket tighter around her. "How long have you traveled these lands?" she asked, her voice cautious but curious. James paused, thinking. He had spent much of his life moving from one place to another, but speaking of it made it feel real, as if all the wandering and hardship could be measured in words. "Most of my life," he said finally. "I was born out west, not far from here. Spent my youth learning to ride and work with cattle. When the work dried up, I moved on. Always moving, always looking for the next place, the next chance, Britt. Life out here, it isn't easy.
Britt.
Never was, never will be. Nayeli listened, studying him carefully.
Britt. There was honesty in his words, a kind of quiet strength she recognized. She had also spent much of her life moving and surviving, though her reasons had been different. Britt. She had learned early to protect herself, to move with purpose and care. Her people had taught her how to read the land, to know when danger was near, and how to trust instincts above all else. Desperate. Yet tonight, instincts told her that she could not survive alone. The cabin grew warmer as the fire grew stronger. Britt. James had added more wood, and the flames now licked the ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The storm outside remained relentless, but inside, the small glow of light and warmth made the cabin feel almost like a sanctuary. Britt. Hours passed, and the wind outside only grew stronger. James and Nayeli began to share small gestures. He offered her a bit of dried jerky from his pack. She handed him a piece of bread she had carried for days. Britt. Neither spoke much, but the exchange said more than words ever could. Britt. Trust was beginning to form. Slow and careful, like the fire they tended together. At one point, a loud crack echoed through the cabin. Britt. A tree branch had broken under the weight of the storm and crashed near the roof. Both jumped, startled. Britt. James rushed to check the outside briefly, holding the door against the gusts, making sure the cabin had not been damaged. Nayeli watched, heart racing, and realized how much courage it took to remain calm when nature seemed so intent on causing harm. Britt. As the storm continued, they began to talk more, cautiously sharing stories of their pasts. James spoke of long rides across the plains, of lonely nights by campfires, of the people he had met and lost along the way. Britt. Nayeli spoke of her family, her village, the skills she had learned to survive in the wild, and the struggles of her people against forces beyond their control. Both spoke with honesty, though neither revealed everything. Britt. They were still strangers. After all, and caution was necessary. Despite the storm, a strange rhythm formed between them. Britt. One would tend the fire, the other would check the small cabin for leaks or weak spots. When James went outside briefly to secure a loose shutter, Nayeli would watch the door, making sure he returned safely. Britt. When Nayeli shifted slightly to make herself more comfortable, James would quietly adjust the fire so it warmed her side of the room.
Their actions were small but meaningful, a silent understanding forming in the midst of chaos.
By midnight, the storm had not lessened. It had grown colder, and the cabin now felt smaller as the wind seemed to press against its walls. Britt. Hunger gnawed at both of them, though they shared what little food they had. The firelight flickered across their faces, revealing fatigue, concern, and the beginnings of cautious respect. Britt.
At one point, Nayeli finally spoke about the storm. "It is stronger than I have seen," she said quietly.
Britt. I do not know how much longer we can stay safe here. James nodded. It may last all night, he said.
Britt. And maybe longer. We have to be ready. Britt. The storm is bigger than either of us, but together we have a better chance than alone. Britt. Nayeli considered his words. She did not fully trust him yet, but she knew he was right. Britt. Alone, she would have had to face the storm in the open, with no shelter, no fire, no warmth. The storm had brought her here, but it had also brought her an unlikely ally. Britt. Hours turned into the early morning. The wind howled, the rain lashed, and the cabin creaked with every gust. Britt. Yet inside, the small fire kept burning, and the presence of each other provided a quiet comfort neither could deny. They spoke in whispers, sharing memories, hopes and fears, building a fragile bridge between them. Bert. Though the storm raged outside, inside the cabin trust began to grow. It was slow, careful, and measured, but it was real. Bert. They had been forced together by circumstance, but they were choosing, in small ways, to support one another. Bert. And as the night wore on, both James and Nayeli realized something important. Survival was not just about strength or skill, but about connection, trust, and the willingness to rely on another when the world turned against you. The storm would not last forever. But tonight, in a small cabin on the edge of the wild plains, two strangers had found a rare thing, a shared understanding, a quiet partnership, and the first flickers of trust in a world that often offered none. The storm had not slowed, Brit. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger as the night wore on, rattling the small cabin with every gust and drenching the surrounding land in sheets of cold, driving rain. Brit. James and Nayeli had long stopped worrying about what had brought them together. Instead, they focused on surviving the storm itself. The wind howled like a wild animal outside, and the cabin shook under its force. Brit. They could hear the trees bending and snapping, the water running off the roof in heavy streams, and the distant rumble of small rock slides that the storm had loosened. James knelt near the fire, feeding it carefully with the last of the dry kindling he had found. Bert. The flames sputtered and danced in the draft that slipped in through the cracks in the cabin walls, but they provided just enough light and warmth. He worked silently, aware of Nayeli's eyes on him. Brit. She did not ask questions. She simply watched, learning how he moved, how he handled himself, and how calmly he faced the danger around them. Nayeli was restless, though she kept her movements quiet. Bert. She had survived many storms in her life, but never like this. Never trapped in a small enclosed space with another person, relying on them as much as herself. She knew the wind would not stop, the rain would not let up, and the cabin's walls could not hold forever if the storm worsened. Brit. She had to stay alert. Every sound was a potential threat. An old board shifting under the wind, a small branch breaking against the side of the cabin, or even James making a sudden movement in the firelight. Brit. Hours passed, and both of them grew tired. Their muscles ached from the long day of travel before the storm, and their minds were alert from constant attention to the roaring weather outside. Brit. James leaned back against the wall, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He looked at Nayeli, who was sitting quietly with her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. Despite the exhaustion and tension, he felt a small spark of respect for her. She was calm, observant, and quietly strong. Someone who had clearly faced danger before and survived. Brit. Suddenly there was a loud crash. A tree branch, heavy with rain, had fallen against the roof with a sharp crack. Brit. Dust and small splinters fell into the cabin, and both jumped. James moved quickly to check the damage.
Desperate. He held a lantern in one hand and pushed back the loose shingles with the other. Nayeli watched from across the room, tense and ready to help if needed.
Brit. Her eyes, however, were wide with worry. She knew how quickly a small disaster could become a real threat in a storm like this.
"We're okay," James said after a moment, though his voice was tight.
Brit. Just a branch, nothing else. We need to make sure the fire stays strong and the doors are secure. Nayeli nodded silently. Brit. She realized that trust was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. The storm had taken away the freedom to doubt, the freedom to walk away. Brit. They had to work together if they were going to survive the night. She got up carefully and moved closer to him, helping to check the windows and doors. Brit.
Her hands were quick and practiced, moving with confidence despite the fear she felt inside. Once the cabin was secure again, they both sat down near the fire.
Brit. Neither spoke at first. The silence was comfortable now, a shared understanding that words were not always necessary. Brit. But eventually, James broke the quiet. We should eat, he said, reaching into his pack for the remaining jerky and bread. Britt, need energy to keep watch through the night. Nayeli took a small piece of bread, tearing it carefully with her hands. I still have some dried fruit, she said, offering it to him. Britt, we can share. James accepted it with a nod, and they ate in silence, each grateful for the small act of kindness. Hunger was sharp, but sharing what little they had created a bond that neither had expected when the night began. Britt. After eating, they returned to watching the storm. The rain had turned into icy sheets, making the trees groan and the ground slippery. Britt. Small rocks tumbled down the hillsides, and the distant river, usually calm, had grown into a roaring torrent that could be heard even from the cabin. James and Nayeli knew that if the storm continued much longer, leaving the cabin could be impossible for hours, or even until morning.
Hours dragged on.
Britt. The fire burned low, and both were forced to feed it carefully to keep the warmth. Nayeli's hands were cold despite the blanket, and James noticed. Britt. Here, he said, moving a little closer and holding a piece of the firewood near her side. It'll help. She hesitated, then accepted the warmth. Britt. Their shoulders brushed lightly, and a strange, unspoken comfort passed between them. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the significance. In the middle of a storm that threatened their very survival, they were learning that trust and small acts of care could mean more than strength or skill alone. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed through the cabin. A small section of the roof had loosened from the storm. Dust and a few small stones fell inside. James jumped to secure it again, but this time Nayeli stepped forward without hesitation. Together, they lifted the loose boards and held them in place, their movements coordinated without needing to speak. For the first time, they acted as a team. The storm had forced them into this role, and they rose to meet the challenge. Once the immediate danger had passed, they sat down again, breathing heavily from the effort. James looked at her, a small smile breaking through the tension. You're quick, he said quietly. You know what you're doing. Nayeli gave a small, respectful nod. Have had to survive, she said simply. Life out here, it teaches you quickly. The fire continued to flicker, casting shadows across their faces. The storm outside was relentless, but inside a fragile bond had formed. They began to talk more freely now, sharing stories of survival and hardship. James spoke of his years riding across the plains, of nights alone by the fire, and of the people he had met and lost along the way.
Nayeli shared her experiences of traveling through the wilderness, avoiding danger, and learning the ways of the land from her elders. As they spoke, the storm outside seemed almost secondary.
The cabin, small and worn, became a place of connection, learning, and mutual respect. They were strangers who had no choice but to trust each other, and that trust was slowly turning into something more meaningful, a recognition of strength, resilience, and courage in the other person. Hours passed. The wind showed no sign of weakening, and the rain continued in unrelenting sheets. Both grew tired again, but this time, exhaustion was accompanied by a quiet sense of security. They had faced danger together, shared food and warmth, and survived immediate threats. The storm could rage all it wanted, but inside the cabin they had created a small world of safety, trust, and cooperation. At one point, James stood to check the fire and found Nayeli watching him closely.
You don't have to stay awake all night, he said. I can keep watch for a while.
No, she said softly. We must both be ready. The storm. It is not predictable. He nodded, understanding. She was right. In a world like this, both had to stay alert. Both had to contribute to survival. And in that realization, the final lines of tension that had separated them began to fade. pain. They were no longer simply two strangers forced together. They were partners in the struggle to survive the night. The hours moved slowly toward dawn. The storm remained fierce, but the small cabin and the fire had kept them alive. Each had learned something about the other. James had learned that Naeli was strong, quick-thinking, and courageous, and Naeli had learned that James was careful, reliable, and skilled in facing danger. They had survived together, and the shared experience had forged a bond that neither had expected at the beginning of the night. Finally, as the first pale light of morning touched the sky, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The wind still blew, and the rain still fell, but there was a sense that the worst had passed. Both James and Naeli looked at each other, tired but relieved. The night had tested them in ways neither could have anticipated, but they had endured. Narration. In the small cabin, the fire still burned, casting light over two figures who had faced the storm together. They had shared food, warmth, and effort. They had protected each other from danger, and in doing so, they had learned that survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about trust, understanding, and the quiet courage to rely on another human being in the face of nature's fury. The storm had been relentless, but it had also been a teacher. By the end of the night, James and Naeli had realized something important. They were stronger together than they were alone. And though the future remained uncertain, they knew that whatever came next, they could face it side by side. The first light of dawn barely broke through the heavy clouds, casting a gray glow over the wet landscape. The storm had weakened, but its effects were visible everywhere. Small streams ran over the rocky plains, carrying mud and debris with them. Trees, bent by the wind, leaned in awkward angles, and broken branches littered the ground. The air was crisp and cold, and the smell of wet earth and wood hung heavily around the cabin. James and Naeli stepped outside cautiously, each alert to the dangers that might remain after the storm. James took the first careful steps, testing the ground for stability. The rain had softened the soil, making it slippery in some areas. He moved slowly, watching each step, and shifting his weight to maintain balance. Daisy, his mare, stood nearby, stamping her hooves on the wet earth, her brown coat slick with rain. James gave her a gentle pat on the neck, murmuring softly to calm her nerves. The storm had been hard on everyone, and the world outside seemed unfamiliar, almost dangerous, in the aftermath. Naeli followed closely, her eyes scanning every direction. Her instincts, sharpened over years of navigating the wild, were on high alert. She noticed the subtle changes the storm had brought, the small rocks that had fallen, the branches that now blocked potential paths, and the deep puddles that could hide unstable ground. She moved carefully, her bare hands brushing against wet leaves and branches to maintain balance. The terrain that had been familiar to her before the storm now seemed unpredictable, and she knew that they had to proceed with caution. The cabin had survived, though not without damage. James inspected the roof again, noting the shingles that had loosened in the wind. He would have to repair it if they were to stay longer, but for now he focused on the immediate needs, clearing debris around the cabin and checking that the door and windows remained secure. Naeli assisted without hesitation, helping to move fallen branches and clean away wet leaves that could become slippery. They worked together quietly, their earlier tension replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Once the immediate tasks were completed, they paused to catch their breath. Both were tired, their bodies sore from the long night of storm and vigilance. James looked at Naeli and noticed the slight shiver in her shoulders, even under the blanket she had wrapped around herself. He gestured toward the cabin. "We should get warm again," he said. "The storm may be done, but the cold lingers." Naeli nodded, grateful for the suggestion. They returned inside and stoked the fire, watching as the flames grew stronger and began to fill the room with warmth. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the wind still rattled the walls of the cabin. The small space felt comforting, safe, and temporary, an oasis after the relentless chaos of the storm. As they warmed themselves, they began to speak of what lay ahead. The storm had changed more than just the landscape. It had shifted their understanding of one another. James realized that Nayeli was not just a survivor. She was skilled, resourceful, and courageous. Nayeli in turn recognized James's reliability, knowledge of the land, and calm in the face of danger. Each had been tested by the storm, and each had proven their strength in ways that words alone could not express. "We can't stay here forever," James said, finally breaking the silence. "The nearest town is miles away, and this cabin isn't much more than a shelter. We'll need to move soon if we want to find supplies and safety." Nayeli nodded thoughtfully. "I know," she said. "The storm may have passed, but the land is still dangerous. Mudslides, fallen trees, and rivers swollen from rain can block paths. We have to be careful." They began planning their route, combining James's knowledge of the territory with Nayeli's understanding of the land and its hidden dangers. They decided to wait until the morning light was stronger, giving them a better view of the terrain before attempting to leave. Both knew that moving too quickly could be risky, especially with the storm's damage still evident. As the morning progressed, the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting soft light on the wet plains. The world outside the cabin was transformed. What had once been familiar paths were now marked by fallen trees and debris. James and Nayeli worked together to clear a narrow path, carefully removing obstacles that could cause injury or slow their progress. Their cooperation was seamless, each anticipating the other's needs and actions. The storm had forced them into a partnership, and that partnership had grown stronger through the night. By midday, the immediate dangers of the storm had been addressed, but new challenges appeared. A small creek, usually shallow, had risen into a fast-flowing stream, cutting across their planned route. James examined it carefully, testing the strength of the current and looking for a safe crossing point. Nayeli, watching from the bank, suggested a narrower section downstream where rocks protruded above the water, offering the possibility of stepping stones. Together they made their way across, each step measured and careful. The cold water splashed against their boots and hands, but neither faltered. The shared struggle created a deeper understanding between them. Each could see the courage and determination in the other. By the time they reached the opposite bank, both were wet, tired, but triumphant. They had survived not just the storm, but its lingering challenges, and they had done it together. As they continued their journey, the landscape slowly returned to its natural rhythm. The wind had calmed, and birds cautiously began to emerge from hiding, their songs tentative but reassuring. The sun climbed higher, warming the wet earth and helping to dry their clothing. James and Nayeli walked in silence for a time, each lost in thought. The storm had tested them in ways they had not anticipated, but it had also revealed qualities they respected in one another: strength, intelligence, and a quiet determination to survive. Eventually, they reached a small ridge that overlooked a valley below. From this vantage point, they could see their next steps: a narrow trail leading toward a settlement where they could find food, shelter, and safety. James pointed it out, and Nayeli studied the path carefully, noting potential obstacles and hazards. Together, they planned their descent, using their combined knowledge to anticipate dangers and prepare for challenges. As they descended, they encountered remnants of the storm's fury. Branches blocking the trail, small landslides that had shifted rocks into the path, and pools of water that had formed in depressions. Each obstacle required careful navigation, and each success strengthened the bond between them. They moved as a team, supporting each other when needed, and sharing the small triumphs of progress. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the settlement. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sounds of daily life, voices, animals, and the occasional wagon wheel reached them faintly through the air. Relief washed over both, but it was tempered by caution. They knew the world beyond the cabin was populated, and human interactions could be as challenging as the storm itself. Brit. James turned to Naeli. "We made it this far," he said. Brit. "The storm is behind us, but there are other challenges ahead. People, dangers, choices." Brit. "We need to be ready." Naeli nodded, understanding his meaning. Brit. The storm had been only one test. Life beyond the cabin required awareness, skill, and careful judgment. Brit. But the night they had shared and the morning they had endured together had created a foundation of trust. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and exhaustion as a team, and that experience would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Brit.
They entered the settlement cautiously, moving slowly and observing the surroundings. People stared at them, wet, tired, and carrying the evidence of their ordeal.
Brit. Some offered curious glances, others whispered among themselves, but none approached aggressively. James and Naeli stayed alert, knowing that survival required both caution and confidence. They found a small inn, modest but welcoming, and decided to rest. Inside, the warmth was immediate, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. Brit. James and Naeli removed their wet clothing and hung it to dry near the fireplace. They ordered a simple meal, grateful for the comfort and sustenance it provided. The innkeeper, a kind man with a friendly smile, offered them a room for the night. They accepted, relieved to find a safe place to rest after the storm and their long journey. As they sat by the fire, eating slowly and letting their muscles relax, they reflected on the night and morning that had changed everything. The storm had forced them together, but it also revealed strengths, weaknesses, and the value of cooperation. They had learned to rely on one another, to trust in shared knowledge and effort, and to respect the resilience of someone different from themselves. By the time they retired to their room, both were exhausted but calm. The inn offered safety and warmth, and the storm was finally behind them. Yet both understood that life's challenges were ongoing. The storm had been a test, but many tests still awaited outside the cabin and beyond the settlement. And as they drifted into sleep, each felt a quiet certainty. The night and the storm, the shared danger, and the cooperation that had carried them through would not be forgotten. They had survived together, learned from one another, and emerged stronger because of it. Whatever came next, they were no longer simply strangers. They were allies, united by the trials they had endured.
The sun rose higher the next morning, casting a warm, golden light across the settlement.
The storm was finally gone, leaving behind a world that looked refreshed yet scarred. Patches of mud and pools of water dotted the streets, and fallen branches from the previous day's winds littered the paths. People were emerging cautiously from their homes and shops, stepping around debris and greeting one another with cautious smiles. James and Naeli stepped outside the inn, feeling the cool air against their skin and savoring the sense of safety that came with the end of the storm. James adjusted his coat and looked around. The settlement was small but functional, with wooden buildings lining the main street and smoke curling from chimneys. Children ran and laughed in the open spaces, and the sound of livestock added life to the scene. After days of travel and nights of survival in harsh conditions, the sight of everyday life, ordinary and calm, was a relief to both of them. They could feel the tension of the storm slowly leaving their bodies, replaced by a cautious optimism. Naeli glanced at James, her dark eyes reflecting the morning light. She had survived many challenges before, but the storm had tested her in ways she had never imagined. The small cabin, the long night, and the shared responsibility of survival had taught her something new, the value of cooperation and trust. She realized that relying on another person, even a stranger, could be a strength rather than a weakness. James noticed her gaze and gave a small nod. "We made it through," he said softly. "The storm, the night, everything." "We made it!" Naeli smiled faintly. "We did," she replied. But her voice carried a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from enduring hardship and knowing that danger could be overcome through care and skill.
They moved slowly through the settlement, taking in their surroundings.
But people stared at them, some with curiosity, others with mild suspicion, but most were too busy with their own routines to pay much attention. James and Naeli were cautious, aware that survival did not end with the storm. The world beyond the cabin was full of challenges, people who might not understand their story, terrain that could still be dangerous, and the reality of continuing life in a land that demanded resilience. As they walked, they spoke quietly, reflecting on what had happened. James told Naeli about the many storms he had faced before, some mild, some devastating, and how each had taught him something new. Naeli shared stories of her people, the lessons learned from elders, and the skills that had kept her alive through harsh times. Their conversation was calm, measured, but meaningful. It was a way to process the night and morning they had endured together, turning experience into understanding. By midday, they reached the edge of the settlement where a small market offered food and supplies. The streets were crowded with people, vendors calling out their goods, and the smell of baked bread, roasted meat, and fresh herbs filled the air. James and Naeli approached cautiously, aware that the world of civilization could be as unpredictable as the wilderness. Yet the familiarity of trade, the simple act of buying food, was comforting. After the uncertainty of the storm, they purchased basic supplies, bread, dried meat, water, and a few small items to repair clothing and gear. The transactions were simple, yet they symbolized more than mere survival. They represented a return to normalcy, a step back into a world where human connections were based on trust and respect, rather than fear. James handled the money with care, explaining quietly to Naeli what each coin represented and how to make the most of it. She listened attentively, appreciating the guidance, and also understanding the importance of resourcefulness in a world where every decision mattered. After gathering supplies, they found a quiet spot near the river running through the settlement. The water sparkled under the sun, flowing steadily after the storm's upheaval. Both knelt by the riverbank, washing their hands and faces, feeling the chill of the clear water on their skin. It was a simple act, yet it carried profound relief. The night in the cabin, the struggle through the storm, and the cautious journey to the settlement had left traces of fatigue, fear, and tension. Now they could feel some of it wash away, replaced by calm and reflection. As they rested, James spoke about the journey ahead. "We've come a long way," he said. But the world doesn't stop being dangerous. We have to keep alert, keep thinking ahead. Today is just the beginning. Naeli nodded. "I understand," she said, "but we survived the storm. That shows we can handle what comes next. Together we can face it." The word "together" hung in the air. Neither had expected to feel connected after the night in the cabin, yet the shared struggle had created a bond neither could ignore. It was not romance, nor was it friendship in the usual sense. It was something deeper, a recognition of strength, courage, and trust in one another. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and danger side by side, and that experience could not be erased. The afternoon passed quietly. They explored the settlement carefully, checking for opportunities to rest, gather supplies, and prepare for the next leg of their journey. James pointed out safe routes, places where food could be found, and spots that were less likely to be dangerous. Naeli contributed her knowledge of the land, noting paths that were stable, hidden hazards, and signs of the natural world that could indicate changes in weather or terrain. Their cooperation was natural now, built on the lessons of the storm and the long night in the cabin. By evening, they returned to the inn, their supplies in hand and a sense of accomplishment between them. They had survived one of the harshest nights of their lives, navigated the aftermath of a storm, and reached safety without injury or major loss. The innkeeper welcomed them back, offering warm food and a place to rest, but they accepted gratefully, feeling the comfort of safety after days of uncertainty. As they sat by the fire eating a simple meal, they reflected quietly on the events that had brought them here. The storm had been relentless, unforgiving, and terrifying. It had tested their endurance, courage, and patience. Yet through it all they had learned something essential, that survival was not merely about skill or strength, but about trust, cooperation, and the ability to recognize the value in another human being. James spoke softly, his voice carrying a note of reflection. I've faced storms before, but I've never had to rely on anyone the way I relied on you. You taught me something, Nayeli. You reminded me that strength isn't just about what you can do alone, but what you can do together. Nayeli looked at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. And you reminded me that sometimes it's okay to trust. Percept. To allow someone else to help. The storm left no other choice, but I am glad it did. I learned that courage can be shared, and that makes it stronger. The fire crackled, casting warm light over their faces. They ate in silence for a while, each lost in thought, considering the journey they had endured and the lessons they had learned. Outside, the night was calm, and the settlement had settled into its own rhythm. The storm was behind them, the cabin no longer their only shelter, and the world seemed a little less harsh. When the meal was finished, they retired to their room at the inn. The bed was small, the room simple, but the comfort it offered was enough. Both were exhausted, but their exhaustion carried a sense of satisfaction. They had survived, learned, and grown stronger together. The night of fear and tension had forged a connection that neither could forget, a connection built on trust, resilience, and shared experience. As they lay down, the quiet of the inn wrapped around them. The storm was a memory now, but its impact remained.
They had faced the worst together and had emerged, not only alive but changed. The bond between them was subtle, unspoken, but real.
It was a recognition that human connection, even in the harshest conditions, could create strength, hope, and courage. James looked at Nayeli for a moment, then closed his eyes, letting sleep take him.
Nayeli did the same, her mind filled with the lessons of the night, the morning, and the journey through the settlement.
They had faced nature, fear, and uncertainty together, and in doing so, had discovered something rare and valuable. Trust, understanding, and respect that transcended the circumstances of the storm. In the quiet of the inn, with the world calm and safe for the moment, both realized that life would continue to bring challenges. Yet they were no longer simply strangers caught in a storm. They were survivors who had found strength in each other, a team forged in adversity, and a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, humanity, courage, and cooperation could prevail.
The next morning, the sun rose fully, shining over a world that was brighter and more welcoming after the storm.
James and Nayeli prepared to continue their journey, each carrying the lessons of survival, the strength of shared trust, and the quiet knowledge that the night in the cabin had changed them both forever. They were ready to face whatever came next, not alone, but together in understanding and resilience. The storm had passed. The world had healed. And two lives, once strangers, had been forever altered by the experience, bound by survival, trust, and the quiet courage of enduring the impossible.